Now, listen, I hear you, Adam. I hear you. There are people who have preferences for eating certain ways, and these are rules they have come to learn to live by. One of my biggest mantras is challenge every habit. Challenge every single habit, even the good ones, because the fact is, you're right. Sometimes the rules are going to get broken. And are we going to burn ourselves to the ground for that? So today I thought we would kind of do a little more thought exploration more than anything. Don't worry, we're going to give you some tips, some tools, some tactics to take away, but we're going to get a little heady today. So hang with us as we explore everybody's personal cages or personal chaos. What are your thoughts about this topic, Adam?
I think it's an important one. When I hear cages, I feel like we're talking about feeling really restricted, really just like, this is too much, overwhelming in a way, and which often leads to reactance where we do the opposite. It's like if we tell our kids to do one thing, they do the opposite because they feel it's too restrictive. And then on the other side, um, you had chaos. And, chaos, I think, leads to feeling confused, feeling overwhelmed because there's too many choices, too much flexibility. So yes, absolutely so important.
Right. So interesting thing about my body tutor is when we bring on clients, we often ask them kind of where they fall on the spectrum of personality, right? I think we talk about it as like rebels, so highly reactive, right? And then we have the disciplined people who really appreciate sort of like routine, rigor, discipline. We have those that want to be convinced. Why shall I be doing this?
Questioners,
And yes. And then what's the one I'm missing?
upholder.
Well, that's the disciplinarian,
Oh,
isn't it?
so the
Right. It's the people pleaser, the obliger.
yes,
Right? Okay. All right. So why am I even bringing this up? Well, I think we like to think, Adam, that everybody is just going to kind of fit in a nice and tidy box, right? But really, I think the message we really want to drive home today is there is no box. There's only the you box, right? And I think we're all shades of all of those. And so this discussion today about cages and chaos is really a discussion about boundaries and figuring out how boundaries apply to each of us personally and how they are important. And everybody has different boundaries, different guidelines, different, even if we want to call it rules that they live by. And the goal of those is to help us live safely and well, right? Which, listen, again, may not be super fancy and flashy, but ultimately it's important, especially when we talk about health, perhaps losing weight, getting in better shape, developing fitness, physique, whatever those goals may look like. We're all going to need some boundaries. Otherwise, we end up in a cage or we end up in chaos. So with that in mind, I want to share a little something that I share with a lot of my clients. And I often tell them, like, look, you got to be your own best parent here, right? So we talk a lot of us struggle, yours truly, with nighttime snacking, right? And something I've worked on personally and I help my clients work on is like when that urge comes up at night to snack. And for me, it was coming up at like 9:30, and my bedtime is like 9:45. I parented myself and said, you know what, let's look at that as a cue to just go to bed. It's bedtime. Let's put yourself in bed. So that became a gentle rule or boundary for me. It's like if hunger comes up at that time of night, there's a boundary. Hit the bed, right? And that's me parenting myself. And so when I think about boundaries, I think about like which end of the parenting scale, the self-parenting scale, do I want to be on? Do I want to be on the complete like absentee parent end of things or the smother end of things? And so that's kind of the spectrum we're looking at today when we're talking about these boundaries. Are we going to absentee our way through it, create chaos, or are we going to smother ourselves into these cages? So do you have any thoughts about any of that?
I like that a lot. I think that's a good framework. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to self-knowledge is the best knowledge, and the key thing is acting on that self-knowledge, and respecting it. And I do think we're very tempted to kind of, like, to your point, to just put ourselves in these buckets, but we're complex human beings, right? And we have all sorts of things, and on some areas we might be one way, and other areas we might be another. But I think understanding what you are and experimenting with more or less boundaries, can be game changing.
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point, and this is, for those of you watching, tactic or practice or step number one is find your chaos and find your cages. And how do you do this? Well, again, we have to apply some tracking tactics here. So maybe tracking what you're doing or what you're eating throughout the day, right? Just track it. It's just data collection, and notice where are your cages? Where do you feel really restricted, limited, locked up? And then notice where your chaos is. Where does it feel like it gets completely out of control, right? Or overwhelming, as Adam pointed to in the beginning. So that's step number one. If you're going to know yourself, like Adam said, you got to track yourself. You got to find the cage, find the chaos, and start getting curious about what's leading to those things, right, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I also think it's really helpful because, I mean, we all like to think we can see ourselves, but truth is we can't see ourselves. So, hint, hint, getting an extra set of eyes on the subject can be really helpful. And, that's what I think we do so well here at My Body Tutor is we have a really incredible team of coaches that have fantastic eyes. They are willing to watch these patterns and behaviors with you. So tracking is step number one, getting to know yourself is step number one, finding your cages, finding your chaos, right? All right. So I've just got some notes here and I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. The second thing that we have to talk about then is like, all right, I figured out I have chaos, I have cages, everybody has it. Super duper. So now what? Well, we can start implementing some new skills, tactics. We can learn some new things. We can try moving some boundaries around, right? And I'm actually doing this with a couple of my clients currently. We've done some witnessing of the patterns of the current chaos and cages, of the current boundaries, and we're starting to move them, right? So the really cool thing is it's really hard to mess any of this up, by the way. I just want to put that out there. Like, disclaimer, can't mess this up, right? Unless you go in one direction for a really long time. And I mean a really long time. So don't be afraid to move your boundaries around. But like, for instance, say you've been living by this rule of a restrictive sort of diet mentality. Adam, we know them, of like no carbs. Well, let's remove that boundary. What would happen, right? Are we going to spin off the planet? Adam, do you spin off the planet when you have a cookie?
No, of course not. But I do think, this is where it becomes a little tricky is like, some people do feel better eating a certain way, and it is a rule for them. But the problem is, if and when they break that rule, inevitably, all hell breaks loose, right? And I think that's where we can have these rules and these kind of boundaries for ourselves, but if we break it, we also need to recover from it because sometimes they do get broken.
Yeah, well, and I think this brings up a really good point, right? Because another crucial part of the process of figuring out your own boundaries, and this is kind of skipping over step 3, well, sort of. Step 3 is get on the bike and ride, right? Which is what we're talking about. Move the boundaries and try it. But step 4 is like reflecting. And I think one of the most crucial pieces of reflecting is, did this critic come up and like admonish me for breaking a rule? Is the rule breaking actually catastrophic, right? We're not talking like shoplifting or, God forbid, like hitting a pedestrian on like a rampage through town, right? So that's the other thing. And I think one thing I've witnessed over the years that becomes so terribly sabotaging is that critic of, oh, you broke the rule, right? And then you just burn yourself at the stake. You just burn yourself right to the ground because, oh my gosh, I ate a carbohydrate. Now listen, I hear you, Adam. I hear you. There are people who have preferences for eating certain ways, and these are rules they have come to learn to live by. One of my biggest mantras is challenge every habit. Challenge every single habit, even the good ones, because the fact is, you're right. Sometimes the rules are going to get broken. And are we going to burn ourselves to the ground for that?
Right. Right.
Right?
Yeah. It's tricky. I mean, the rules and boundaries and, guardrails, whatever you want to call them, are there to serve us. And, when they start owning us and they're the ones in control, then they're clearly no longer serving us.
Right. So maybe a conversation that we should be having is, where does a boundary become like shackles,
Yeah, that's a good
right?
question.
So again, we end up in that caged end of things, right? And because if we get to the point where once those shackles break and we just totally lash out, that's really something to examine. This is no longer a boundary. This is a cage. I put myself in a cage. Um, and listen, you are going to have a reaction to it, right? You can only be in a cage so long. Once the door opens, well, all bets are off. So again, I think one of the hard things about this topic, and I know we sort of struggled with even like getting this video off the ground because it is a hard discussion. There's no one way. There's no one size fits all. And the truth is nobody can figure out your boundaries but you, right? And so for me to sit here and say, well, what works best for me is, and I believe it works best for everyone, is just it's false. It's just false. And that's granting, I don't know, but it won't, my boundaries won't work for everybody.
Right.
Your boundaries won't work for everybody, right?
Right.
But I do really, really believe in the fact that boundaries are different than shackles. And everybody needs boundaries because that's how you create healthy space for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, think of it as on a highway. They have guardrails for a reason, right? It keeps you moving along. It protects you. And that's the idea. But
Right.
I think that's the idea. And I think, if your boundaries are causing guilt, self-regulation, is a fascinating thing in that, like, we all have values, we all have goals, we all have desires for ourselves. And when we kind of go against them, it brings up all sorts of feelings, including guilt. And, I think a lot of people run away from the feeling of guilt and they say, all right, whatever is causing me to feel guilt, I'm just going to remove that versus exploring why they can't comply with what they want to do. And I think that's a perfect time to explore your boundaries and what you're asking of yourself and what your, boundaries and guardrails are doing for you. And instead of just removing them altogether, maybe it's time to adjust them.
I really like that. I think that adds something very tangible to kind of this formula we've got set up here with all our steps. Look for the guilt, right? And you've said it so many times, and I share this with my clients. I'm like Adam always says, guilt isn't necessarily a negative emotion. It's something to move toward and get curious about. Because I think you're spot on, Adam. Guilt is a compass in a way. And often we realize when we start exploring it that we've got some lines crossed in there. And we kind of whitewash everything and say, well, it just must be because I'm bad. But
Yeah.
no, it just means there's a conflict that needs exploring. And yeah, an opportunity to move some boundaries.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, yes, we're biased, but like, I've seen what this can do since 2007. For thousands of people. When you have an expert who could help you experiment with different boundaries and different guardrails, and kind of suggest things, and see how this feels for you, and try this on, etc. That's really really powerful. Because when you're kind of left to your own devices, it's much harder to see what you can't see what you can't see, obviously, and it's tricky because we don't realize that. We don't realize we have blind spots sometimes.
Right. Yeah. So, all right. So let's kind of bring this round full circle, kind of make some sense of this chaos,
All right.
if you will. So, all right, if we're going to put this in kind of a formula,
Yes.
the first step is we got to get to know ourselves, and we can do that through tracking behaviors and choices throughout the day, watching for the guilt, right? That's going to be an indicator. Watching for the cages, watching for the chaos.
So just tracking
right?
everything to bring awareness to it. Okay.
I like it. Okay. Number 2, learning some new skills, exploring like All right. For instance, the skills we teach all the time, the pause, the broccoli test, the fullness scale, the plate, those are some new skills we might learn and try applying in our current patterns, right? So that's actually step 3, applying and getting on the bike. That's the only way to learn to ride a bike, by the way, is to get on it. I really wish there was another way, right?
Yeah.
But you got to get on a bike to learn to ride a bike. And then step 4 is reflecting. Don't skip this step. If you happen to be working with a coach and they ask you, how did you achieve that? Take the time to reflect, because that's how you reinforce it in your brain, right? That's actually, the processing is part of the learning. If you're just kind of going throughout the day, tracking stuff, trying stuff, and then never reflecting, nothing gets reinforced. You're never going to make any sense out of anything. So don't skip the step of reflection and exploration, like the thought work afterward, right?
Right.
So that's kind of the formula in my mind. And I just want to kind of label over all of that grace and flexibility, right? Like, we got to watch for those rigid rules and we got to watch for complete abandon. But we want to kind of have this theme of grace and flexibility with any boundaries that we set, because life is just not so black and white. You personally, Adam, you have your own black and white. I have my own black and white, but there is not the black and white in life. And it's just not that neat and tidy. And so that's my full circle. What's your full circle?
We'll leave it at that. I think that's a lot of food for thought. And even more so, to make it even more confusing, to add some chaos to the circle here. I don't think we are black and white, because there's times where I like boundaries and then there's times where I don't. And there's times where in my life I, like these kind of rules that I set for myself. And there's times where I have zero rules. And that's the tricky part, but that's also what, keeps the world going around. And, the idea is, find someone ideally to help you or to help yourself with this, and experiment and, see what works for you, test drive things, and notice how you feel. That's really important, as we said, because when you do that, it really is a gauge to whether you need to kind of push some boundaries out or, bring some boundaries closer to where, you're have a little more rules, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys. Well, we did give you a lot of food for thought, and we'd love to hear what you think. So leave some comments down below or email Adam. He always loves, hearing about what you're thinking, and we will see you next time.